Hello, my name is Dwight Reynolds, and I teach Arabic literature, music, and culture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. It's a pleasure to talk to you today as part of this wonderful program on connected histories of the Renaissance. The focus of this talk will be on music in al-Andalus, that is Muslim Spain, sometimes called Moorish Spain, although that term has fallen a little bit out of favor recently, and also the connections between Muslim Spain and the music of the medieval and early Renaissance in Europe and across the broader Mediterranean. I've divided this talk into 4 parts, each of which should be around 15 minutes. I will see if I can stick to that timing. The first part will be about musical instruments. The second part will be about music in Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus. The third part will be about Andalusi music in northern Spain, in the Christian kingdoms of the north. And finally, in part 4, we'll follow these Andalusian music traditions from the medieval period all the way through to their modern traditions that are still performed in many parts of the Middle East. So to begin with, we'll start with musical instruments because the study of musical instruments historically is an easy way to come to grips with and understand the cultural networks and contacts that thrived in the medieval period all the way across the Mediterranean into Europe, down into the Arab world, etc. The entire region inherited a diverse group of instruments, instrumentarium, as we say in academics, from antiquity, that is Greco-Roman culture and ancient Egypt, the Hittites, the Babylonians, Sumerians, etc. These instruments consisted of harps and lyres, various different types of plucked and strummed lutes, various different flutes, single and double flutes, also single and double reeds, that is things that are comparable to our modern clarinet and oboe, panpipes, many different types of horns, trumpets, brass instruments, and of course percussion instruments, drums and tambourines. But quite frankly, this music would have sounded very ancient, very foreign to our modern ears, especially because the focus was on such instruments as the harps and lyres, as we can see in this and the following slides. Note that here we see an entire procession of lyres being played by musicians, possibly also singing, certainly not an instrumental grouping that we would find in any type of modern music. Another image also of a lyre being performed privately. This is actually from the ruins of Pompeii. And yet another one. This is a harp. The difference between a harp and a lyre is that a lyre has 3 sides as a frame and a harp only has 2. Double flute, the panpipe, various types of woodwind instruments or horns, and many different brass instruments. The Romans in particular were very fond of having large groups of brass instruments, trumpets, etc. Here we have a Roman mosaic that's actually found in Libya, which was part of the Roman Empire, of course, and we see what would strike us as a very strange clustering of musical instruments. One long brass trumpet, a couple of horns, these were actually called tubas, and a portatile or portable organ that is powered with one hand pumping the bellows and the other hand playing the keyboard. The music that we are used to thinking of as medieval and Renaissance music is really quite distinct from this ancient sound because there are 2 instrument types that arrived and completely changed the soundscape of the medieval Mediterranean, and both of these new instrument types arrived via Islamic territories. The first of these is the lute, or the Arab lute. The Arabic word for the lute is al-oud, Oud means wood or wooden. The al is simply the definite particle the wood or wooden one. And it was probably called this because other types of lutes sometimes had skin faces, and the face of this lute, the sound box, is made of wood. There were different types of lutes in the ancient world, but most of them were long-necked lutes with very small sound boxes, so they didn't have a very powerful sound. Here we see one image, again, of a harp and a lute from ancient Egypt. Another image, again, harp and lute, and this time with a rectangular frame drum, a type of tambourine, if you will. But this instrument, which has remained virtually unchanged for some 1400 years, is quite distinct. First of all, it has a very short neck, not a long neck. Its peg box is cocked back at a sharp angle. It has a very large, deep sound box, the body of the instrument, and it is constructed by piecing together strips of wood that can be shaved very thin, giving it a much more resonant sound, and it's also in the shape of a pear, if you will, piriform. This musical instrument was apparently so superior to other types of lutes that it swept across the Mediterranean and pushed away all the other forms of lutes and became the dominant instrument in the Arabo-Islamic world and also in medieval and Renaissance Europe. One of the ways we can mark the distribution, the dissemination of this musical instruments is to note that virtually every European language calls this instrument by a name derived from the Arabic word al-Oud, various forms of lute, laud, etc., as you can see here. We have a number of medieval images of these lutes. One of them here from a 13th century romance called Bayad and Riyad. This is from medieval Iberia, from al-Andalus. And of course you see the young man playing the lute on the far right. He's busy trying to court and flirt with the woman who's sitting on the far left, who's wearing the very fancy headdress, and her entourage of womenfolk are listening attentively. This image is of a female musician performing on the lute, and it's in the ceiling of the Cappella Palatina in Palermo, Sicily, completed about 1150. Although this was actually under the reign of the Christian Norman kings. Sicily had, of course, been Islamic, Muslim, for several centuries, and many aspects of Muslim culture continued well into the Middle Ages. Here is an image from Byzantium, a tiny little carving on an ivory casket, also showing a lute. The other type of musical instrument that completely changed the soundscape of the medieval Mediterranean were what historians of music call bowed lutes. That is simply the bowed string instruments. That is, string instruments that are played with a bow, such as the violin, viola, cello, bass, etc. We are so surrounded by these bowed string instruments that it would be easy to think that this is an age-old, musical technique from time immemorial, but this is not the case. Interestingly enough, it appears to have emerged in Central Asia, possibly somewhere around modern Uzbekistan, only in the 8th century, and then from there spread in every direction, east, west, south, etc. And this new technique of music making, ended up playing a very strong role in almost every tradition it came in contact with. This key technique from the 8th century in Central Asia gave birth to all of the bowed string instruments in the world: fiddles, viols, rebecs, etc. In the Mediterranean, there were basically two different routes. One route, this instrument spread through the Arabo-Islamic world, the Arab lands, across North Africa, and then up through Sicily, Italy, and up through Iberia, Spain, and Portugal. But there was also another sort of northern route, and that is that these instruments came through Byzantium and then were introduced into the Balkans and then further west. This is probably the oldest European image of a bowed string instrument. It's a little bit difficult to see, I understand. This is actually a capital that is the stone that sits on the very top of a pillar. And it's referred to as the capital of the musicians, de los músicos, because it has 4 faces, and on each face is a different musician performing a different musical instrument. And this dates to around 950, the mid-10th century in Cordova, which was, of course, the capital of Muslim Spain. Here's another image that can give you a little better sense of the bow that is being held and pulled across the strings there. And as you can see, he's playing it against the chest, which is, of course, a technique, a position that's still found in many folk fiddling traditions around the world. Just comparison, one of the other sides here is a man playing the lute, and you can see that the instrument's being held at a completely different angle and is clearly being plucked with his fingers. The earliest image of a bowed musical instrument by a Christian artist is from 30 to 40 years later in the late 10th century in a monastery in northern Spain. And this is an image that occurs in a manuscript that is a commentary on the book of the Apocalypse, or the book of Revelations. And the monk who wrote this commentary's name was Beatus, and so these are referred to as the Beatus manuscripts. There are about 27 of them, I think, and they are beautifully illustrated, wonderful art. And this particular image shows angels flying in the air, and then down below, standing on the ground, are these 4 figures playing this rather unusual looking string instrument. I don't know if any of you are string players. I'm a violinist myself, and I look at this and think it must have been very difficult to play an instrument like this. First of all, it looks rather large and heavy, but also note that they're holding it away from themselves, hanging in midair and bowing across it. Excuse me. And basically, it looks quite unrealistic. My personal hypothesis is that this artist probably had received a verbal description of this musical instrument, but himself had never actually seen one, which might help explain the sort of unusual aspect of it. But within 2 or 3 decades, we find in another monastery, so now we're in the early 11th century, the first quarter, between 1000 and 1025, another Beatus manuscript, and this is the passage in Revelation for the adoration of the Lamb on Mount Zion, and we can see here that we have fiddle players or viol players. And this, of course, is much more realistic. This looks like it could be related to our modern violin. And notice that already we have 2 different playing positions. The 2 figures on the left are holding the instrument on the shoulder, the way we play a modern violin or viola, and the 2 on the right are holding it across the chest, which, as I said, still exists in many sort of folk traditions, fiddle traditions, even in the United States. I mentioned that there was also an Eastern route, and the Byzantines in Greek called this the lyra. They essentially repurposed the name of the ancient lyre, the type of lyre that's related to a harp, and began calling this instrument the lyra. And this is from, again, the 10th to 11th century. It's a little hard to date. It's a very small image. It's carved into another ivory cascut, and we can see that it has a little stand on it so that it can be held on the knee or on the thigh or perhaps played on the ground. And so we refer to this type of fiddle as a spike fiddle. Going back to the Cappella Palatina, again in Palermo, Italy, we find this wonderful image of a musician playing a stringed instrument, and this is clearly related to the Arab rabab. And we can see that the musician is sitting essentially cross-legged and is holding the instrument vertical. We know that the vertical position was the original, the oldest position. And if you look at the top of the instrument, there is a sort of an unusual decoration, and it's a little hard to tell what that might be from this image. But if we look at the modern Balkans and also in Central Asia, we find that it is actually very common to carve animal heads, particularly horse heads, on the top of these bowed string instruments. Remember that this music making technique emerged in Central Asia, where it emerged among horse nomads, who obviously had very little else to build musical instruments with, so a little bit of wood and some skin and then horsehair, right? Since they were great archers, it may have been someone experimenting by using their archery bow and pulling it across a string and discovering that you could make a sound like this. In any case, animal heads on top of these instruments is quite common. Once these two musical instruments begin to make their way around the Mediterranean, we find image after image after image of the two of them next to each other. A bowed fiddle and a lute here. This is a Greek painting. A bowed rabab, or Arab fiddle, and a plucked lute, again from the Cappella Palatino in Sicily. Here is an image from Spain. This is a 13th century work called the Cantigas de Santa Maria, the songs of the Holy Virgin Mary, and again a bowed musical instrument next to an Arab lute. I actually love the way the lute sticks out of the frame of the image and almost runs into the text, which is not shown in this image. Again, a bowed musical instrument and a plucked lute. Note the animal head carved at the top of the plucked lute. And all the way into the Renaissance, this is much later, you can see the influence of Renaissance-style painting, but once again, a bowed string instrument accompanied by a plucked lute. Here are two images from the Cantigas de Santa Maria, and I would like to look very carefully, especially at the image on the left. You can see that it is made of two different materials. The upper half, where the fingers are, is made out of metal or wood. The lower half is probably made out of skin. And if you can look closely, you can see that the body of the instrument, where the skin is, is indented slightly. It's slightly wasted, and then played with this short but highly curved bow. If we go to modern Morocco, we found almost exactly the same instrument, still being performed as part of the Andalusian musical tradition of Morocco. We find this is called the rabab, the Arabic name for the instrument, and it has a metal fingerboard and a skin body, and you can see that it is slightly indented on both sides. It has scarcely changed in over 1,200 years. Here is a modern Moroccan ensemble, and we will listen to a video of them at the end of this presentation. Once again, you can see over on the left, you can see the rabab, and you can see the Arab lute. So in summary, in the 9th century, the northern Mediterranean, that is Europe, did not possess either the Arab lute or any bowed string instruments. They had already arrived in the Arab world, but they had not yet been disseminated into Europe. But by the 11th century, these new instruments were found all the way around the Mediterranean and were important elements for several centuries in European and Arab medieval and later Renaissance music, which means that wherever one traveled in the medieval Mediterranean, basically all of the instruments one encountered would have been familiar, even if the individual melodies or the style of music was not. These new instruments, the Arab lute and the bowed strings, become the icons of Western late medieval and early Renaissance music, showing once again how connected all the different regions of the Mediterranean world were during the Middle Ages. And that's the end of part 1. In part 1, we explored music in the medieval Mediterranean and Europe through the dissemination of new musical instruments, particularly the bowed string instruments, the fiddles, the viols, and the Arab lute, and remarked how they completely changed the soundscape of the region and laid the basis for what the music that we think of as medieval and Renaissance music in Europe, and also for music in the Arab world, of course. Another way to explore the history of music, which I find equally fascinating, is to just explore the biographies of individual musicians. So what I'm going to do in this segment is talk about music history through the musicians themselves. And we will start with some musicians who performed in the court of Cordoba, the capital of al-Andalus, the capital of Muslim Spain, during its heyday, its golden age, from the 8th to the 10th centuries. This is an image of the great mosque of Cordoba, with its famous repeated alternating red and white arches that sort of extend off into the distance, almost providing an optical illusion. And the magnificent mosaic work that surrounds the Qibla, which is the niche that points toward Mecca and allows Muslims to know what directions to pray in. Here's another image of that Qibla inside the great mosque of Cordoba. It's difficult to describe the degree to which Cordoba was a cosmopolitan cultural center, especially in contrast to the other cities of Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries that were only beginning to come out of what we would sometimes refer to as the Dark Ages, and to acquire the trappings of medieval culture. But one of the ways that we can measure this is to say that, for example, the largest libraries in Europe at this point had only a couple of hundred books. The Vatican, even in the 15th century, had only about 450 books, where we have historical accounts that describe the Great Library of Cordoba as having 150,000 books. Even if that number is slightly exaggerated, it demonstrates the discrepancy between the two regions in terms of literacy, literary production, readership, and there are many other ways that we could demonstrate this, but I use that one fact. So let's turn to the court of Cordoba in its golden age and look at a few of the musicians that performed them. In the early 9th century, so sometimes between 800 and 825, Sulaim was a court musician in Cordoba, and he was already a court musician, and a delegation from the Christian kingdoms in the north arrived in Cordoba. He was charged with hosting them in his house, and it's not really clear why he was chosen, but it may be because he was either still a Christian or a newly converted Christian to Islam, and therefore spoke Romance, that is sort of a proto-ancient Spanish. The other thing is that it appears that this delegation had musicians in it, and so perhaps he was asked to host them because of these musicians. In any case, we have a biography of him that talks about the arrival of this delegation of Christians from the north, and then it says that he learned music from these Christians, and that he mastered the music from these Christians. The delegation left, went back home to the north, and a little while after that, his main patron, the son of the emir, the ruler of al-Andalus, had purchased a new female slave singer, a singing slave girl from Baghdad. And he put the two of them together, and he told Sulaim, his male musician, to learn all of the repertory and the songs from this new slave singer that he had just purchased. Basically, she would have arrived from Baghdad, which was at that point the great cultural center of the Islamic world, and probably arrived, if you will, with the top 40, the greatest hits, the most recent songs from Baghdad, and his patron Al-Mughira wanted to add this to the performances, the repertory that he had in his little entourage. So he combined the two of them, put the two of them together. Sulaim learned that music, and then enigmatically we are told that he combined the two, the music from the Christians and the new music from Baghdad, and created something completely new. So if you think about this, this is in the early 9th century. This is an extraordinary example of musical interchange in Cordoba from the northern Christian regions of Spain and from Baghdad across the Mediterranean. And you also think, wow, this musician, Sulaim, knew apparently 4 different styles or 4 different repertories of music. There was first the music that he had been performing as a singer and a musician in the court before the Christians arrived. Then he learned the style or the repertory of the Christians. Then he learned the new music, the latest music from Baghdad, and then he apparently created some sort of hybrid and combined them in some way and created yet a new style. So this is, an utterly remarkable, it's just a snapshot, but it gives us, just in one musician's, life experience, quite a wonderful image of these networks at work. A second musician, his name is Hassan ibn Ziyad, and he is from North Africa, and he traveled to Cordoba and became a court musician and was performing in the court. And then, for reasons that are very difficult to determine, he left Cordoba and traveled to the north. And then after many years living in the north, he returned to Cordoba, bringing the music that he had learned from the north back down to Cordoba. The biography of this musician is written in a very poetic style. So unfortunately, there are phrases where we just sort of scratch our head and don't quite know what to make of it. So we know that Hassan ibn Ziyad was from North Africa and he traveled to Cordoba. And then in his biography, there's this poetic phrase. It says, "The heart of the night whispered to him that he was, or because he was, a kafir, that is an unbeliever, a non-Muslim. And he took fright and traveled to the north, where he lived among the heathens for many years. And when he returned poor, not having earned any money other than the songs he had learned there. But the emir forgave him his misbehavior and brought him back into the court." Some scholars have suggested that this phrase, "the heart of the night whispered to him," to suggest that Hassan ibn Ziyad might have been black, might even have been from sub-Saharan Africa. But it's up, we really don't know more than that. But what we do have is another route through these networks, and that is from Africa, North Africa, to Cordoba, up into the Christian kingdoms, and traveling back. So presumably he took Arab music with him when he went to the north, and when he came back, he returned with some form of what we would call perhaps Christian music or Christian Spanish music. Again, a snapshot of musical hybridization and exchanges. A third musician is Saida, who we know was a Christian who was from Cordoba and who was a very good-looking young man who converted to Islam, learned music, and then traveled to the east, that is to Syria and Iraq, etc. In his biography, we are told that he was an acolyte who was on his way to becoming a monk and lived in a monastery, but he was apparently so good-looking that his fellow monks were jealous of each other and began fighting, and he created so much disruption in monastic life that he fled the monastery, converted to Islam, learned music, and then traveled to the east. And the traveling to the east is a very dramatic story because he traveled by ship, which was in a shipwreck and it sank, and he managed to save himself by clinging to a plank of wood and eventually drifted onto the beach somewhere approximately in Tunisia and continued his travels east by land. Qalam, which means reed pen, the pen you write with, was a female Christian Basque, and her father was a chief of one of the Basque clans and led a sort of rebellion against the Muslims. She was taken captive, shipped across the Mediterranean to Medina, where she was trained as a musician, and then sold back to Cordoba, where she became one of the favorites of the Emir Abdurrahman II, and bore him a son, although this was one of his 45 sons, one of his 80-something offspring, so she wasn't particularly special in that, but she was a very renowned musician and singer, and we will talk more about female slave singers in a few moments. Finally, there is the most famous musician of Al-Andalus, and that is a singer named Ziryab. It's difficult to separate history from legend with this fellow because the legendary account of his life has grown and grown and grown over the centuries. But we do know that he was black, he was trained in Baghdad, he performed in the court of Tunis in Tunisia, and then came to Cordoba. Now, the early texts treat him as a very good musician, but they don't really, give him any particular special status. And in fact, several of the early texts about him, the sources, are rather disparaging. But the legend begins to emerge in the 11th century, some 200 years after his death, based on a book that was probably written by a descendant of his. We think it was someone 6 generations removed from him. But in that book, this book praised Ziryab as absolutely the perfect courtier who knew everything about everything and dictated not only things about music, but how people were to wear their clothes, protocol in the court, etc., and became the great arbiter of taste. But this legend seems to reflect practices of the 11th century and not of the 9th century when he actually lived. So those 5 musicians showed us different trajectories, to and from, north and south, east and west. One of the things that is very remarkable about this period of time is that in the Islamic world, in the Arabic-speaking world, most of the singers, the male singers, were free singers, were not slaves. And they therefore had to travel and seek patronage from patrons in different courts, etc. But the vast majority of the female singers of this time period were known as qiyan. This is the Arabic word that specifically means singing slave girls. This phrase is not one that I like. I use it from time to time. I try to avoid it. I try to say things like female slave singers, because these women are certainly not girls, first of all, in terms of age. Many of them perform and are famous into a ripe old age, but also they did far more than sing. They were trained in a whole variety of different arts of entertainment. They memorized large amounts of poetry so they could be recited upon demand, and were also trained in the composition of poetry. They sang, they played musical instruments, they were trained in calligraphy. They were basically trained to be good companions for their male patron and for his guests. And so they were trained in all types of conversation, literary and historical anecdotes, jokes, etc., even in shadow puppetry and dance, and in a few cases, even weaponry. These might have been sort of fake battles, faux battles fought in the court for entertainment. But they really had an extraordinary training. Probably the closest thing that we could think of are the geisha of Japan, although of course there are many differences between this tradition and that of the geisha. But if you think of these women as being highly trained, educated, even intellectual beings that participated in the highest circles of male socializing. Here is an image from the Cappella Palatina, again in Palermo. We've seen this. This is a female singer playing an Arab lute. Here is a dancer from the Cappella Palatina, and she is dancing what is called a sleeve dance. These long flowing pieces of cloth are actually attached to the sleeves of her outfit. And here's an image that I very much like also from the 13th century in northern Spain, like the Cantigas de Santa Maria. This is called El Libro de Juegos, the Book of Games, or it's also called the Book of Chess. And here we can see some women playing chess. Here's a close-up. So these are probably two Muslim women, judging from the fact that they both have henna on their hands. And they're tanned in different, in different patterns. Although we can see that on one side, on the right, sort of a reddish all over, and on the left, more on the fingertips, and it looks like there's a pattern on her knuckles. But the key point here is that they are being accompanied or entertained by the female lute player in the corner of the room, who is probably one of these Qian. One instance where we believe these Qian may have played a very important role in cultural exchanges is the siege of the city of Barbastro in 1064. So this is 2 years before William the Conqueror invades England, the Norman conquest. The Christian forces from the north laid siege to this town, and the Muslims withstood the siege for quite a long time, but water was brought to the city via an underground aqueduct or passage of some sort. And the historical sources say that a boulder blocked this underground passage, so the Muslims were forced to surrender, which led to a horrendous slaughter. It's unclear whether the boulder blocking off the underground passage was a natural event or whether the Christians did it to cut off the water supply, but we are given a very lurid and detailed description of the slaughter of thousands of Muslims in the city once the Christian forces made their way in through the main gate. We are told that one single Christian leader received as part of his share of the booty 1,500 female slaves. I unfortunately skipped a slide, but you can go back and look at it. The final line in the earlier slide was that after the massacre had occurred, one of the Christian leaders, took with him many beautiful young Muslim maidens, handsome boys, etc., all of which he was taking home, probably to France, to give to his superior. One of the leaders of the siege of Barbastro was Guillaume VIII, or William VIII of Aquitaine, and he happens to have been the father of Guillaume or William IX, who was frequently referred to as the first troubadour. Now, his father died when he was 15, and he became the master of the household. This was some 20 years before he composed his first troubadour song around the year 1100. So this first troubadour may well have grown up in and own Andalusi, singing slave girls, that is, Qian, that were seized during the siege, were taken during the siege of Barbastro. In the aftermath, a Jewish middleman was sent into the Christian-held city in an attempt to ransom the daughters of a Muslim nobleman who had escaped the massacre. And we have this fascinating description in the historical sources where the Jewish middleman, a friend of this Muslim noble, comes in and he finds the Christian warrior completely transformed. He is now wearing the best clothes, the finest silks, the wonderful garments of the Muslim nobleman who'd lived there, and lounging around without having even moved the furniture, we're told. And he is listening to the music of a female singer who is playing the lute and singing to him, and even though he could not understand the words, he was clearly moved to the point of ecstasy. An Italian historian, Amatus of Monte Cassino, writes of this siege that the Christian knights, once they had won the battle, gave themselves over to the love of women, which he said so angered Christ that he allowed the Muslims to retake the city the following year.